If you want to read better and think more clearly and understand the ideas shaping our world, then this might be for you. You should join the Dr. John Patrick Book Club. It's a private online community where we read great books together and learn how to think, not just what to think. Inside, you're going to have access to Dr. John Patrick as we work through books and ask questions. If you've ever felt like there are books you should be reading or ideas that you want to understand better, but you didn't want to do it alone, this is a good place to start. You can find the link in the show notes or the description below to join.
Hello, everyone. This is John Patrick. Most of you who are listening probably know that. Those that don't, retired professor of biochemistry pediatrics, but primarily interested over the last 30 or 40 years in the problems of integrating ethics, culture, faith, and public policy. And this week, I usually talk about the books that I've been reading this week, and to a little degree that will happen today. But as I was thinking about this particular talk, the thing that was bothering me was the way people are talking about resources. Trump talking about minerals and security resources. And there's a failure there to realize what the real resources of the Western world have been. And they're what the rest of the world wants. And they come with the temptations of Christ, where he points out, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Spiritual resources are totally neglected, and then we wonder why we see horrendous things happening. Now, another input into this particular argument comes from watching what's happening in Iran. Now, the stuff that comes out of there, we have no means of really checking them. But I don't think there's any question that something quite extraordinary is going on beyond the end of the Muslim theocratic regime, which seems inevitable now. But the secular world is apparently utterly unaware that the evidence is pretty good that Iran is probably having something very close to an 18th century revival in our world, except it's not a revival, it's a beginning. The conversion rate to Christianity in Iran, we can't be certain of it, but it's certainly astronomical. And the stories that are coming out are equally amazing. You just put into Google conversion stories from Iran, and I suspect it will lead you there. Now, I was listening to one and I thought, I listen to them every now and again and wonder how much of this has been tarted up afterwards and how much is just straightforward truth. And this one was very convincing because it was a young woman who, according to the narrative, had been born in a family that was high up in the theocratic regime, not imams, but next layer down. And she had her life totally controlled. As she put it later on, I never felt that I had been seen or loved. There was a hole in her heart. She didn't quite put it that way, but what's the point of this life where everything she did was decided by other people? Her family, particularly her father, her grandmother, and her day was totally scheduled around the 5 prayers that she had to recite in a language she didn't understand. She had to learn verses from the Quran, which she also didn't understand. And then in her 20s, a remarkable thing happened. The emptiness of her life was overwhelming. And then she had an experience of, which is apparently quite common in Iran now, of a dreamlike state in which a man in white came and introduced her to being loved, is what she describes. And she knew that the name of that man was Jesus. She never had a Bible, of course. It wasn't allowed in her house. It wasn't allowed in Iran, theoretically. But those things can be fixed, and they were. And you can go find the story. It's deeply moving. It's a very good story, even if it's been polished somewhat. It's beautifully presented in the end. And she now lives in Germany and works with refugees. She gave up, in material terms, everything you could imagine. She lived, as she put it, in a gilded cage. She gave that all up. Her life was at risk, probably still is. And she said, I would give up anything to avoid losing the love of Christ. It's very, very moving. And yet you don't hear any discussion in the political, philosophical arena. No, that's not quite fair. You hear virtually no discussion. Certainly very near zero in the political arena. There are people now in the intellectual world who are beginning to realize that we have a problem. The greatest resource we had in the Western world that the rest of the world didn't have was the narrative that we are created by God, that we are loved, that we have a problem, and that was fixed by Christ. We can argue about exactly how that works. That's a different matter. What we, hopefully, those of you listening to know, that the blind Bartimaeus statement is true of you. Once I was blind, and now I see. Now, in my case, and out of many of you watching, I suspect you grew up not in oppressive Muslim environments, but in a loved Christian environment, which is also constricting, but not in a bad way, because in my case, anyway, I had access to books and was encouraged to read, and I had a good education. And I never questioned that the biblical story was in essence true. And I found in my favorite authors that, lo and behold, most of them also believed that. And those that didn't and were good authors could write seriously about what a problem that was. Orwell certainly saw the problem. Huxley saw the problem. As Postman put it in his lovely book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, Orwell feared that we would not have access to the truth. Huxley was probably closer when he feared that we would not care about the truth. But now we've got to another stage that neither of them wrote about, really. We don't even know how to think about truth anymore, not in the metaphysical sense. Wisdom has disappeared in the Western world, where for 20 centuries, really, wisdom had been understood to be important, and now the word is not used. You never hear politicians talk about wisdom. You don't hear them talk about cultural backgrounds, or at least you didn't. Now, amazingly, this talk in this area is happening around the world, but particularly in Africa. I, of course, was first introduced to this many years ago, in the 80s, actually, when my primary interest was malnourished children, and I went to Africa to try and help a mission hospital get a handle on the problem of malnutrition. Now, I was approaching it as a reductionistic scientist, which is what I had done. I'd been part of a team that actually showed, give us a child at death's door, a 10-pound 2-year-old, and if we keep it alive for 12 hours, and that we can almost always do by doing nothing more than treating the infections they all had, and in fact that was the best thing to do. We had by the time I left Jamaica in 79, we went through 100 £10 2-year-olds in a row and saved every single one. That's an amazing outcome. When that unit started some 30 years before, the death rate was approaching 50%. So technically we knew how to do it. But I also watched the literature and saw that there was no evidence that change was occurring in Africa. So I went against my will, but my family and others, as I learned, many others, intended that I should go, and I went. But I wasn't arrogant enough to think that I could make what we'd done in Jamaica happen in Africa when other people have been trying to do it for 30 years without success. So I used my children to work for me because I needed to know that what was being done the way I wanted done. And they could resuscitate malnourished children as teenagers. They did what I told them to do, and it was fine. It succeeded. I started trying to train nurses, and I began to realize that there was a dimension here that I hadn't thought about at all. And for want of a better word, we could call it culture. I remember having a group of nurses, in inverted commas, with very basic sort of training. They were basically running a clinic in a village as well as they could, with a few medicines and a little training. They could make some difference, and it was a beginning. But they wanted me, the professor, to give them a lecture. So I couldn't say no. They expected to have, slides and pictures and all that stuff. And no, I'm not going to do that because it's irrelevant to your world. I want to start with what you use as one of your tools, the growth chart. And being the cynic that I am, I didn't make any presumptions. And I said, here's some data. And I fabricated some data. Now I want you to plot it on the chart. Weight, height, and weight for height against time. And it took half a day to get them to the point where they would do it, because for them it had no meaning. The first attempt, they didn't come anywhere near looking at the data. They just gave me a chart which they knew I would like. If they were running their clinic and a child had a chart like that, the doc would be pleased. But I hadn't given them that data. And they had no concept of data in the way that we think about it. That you could have honest data, erroneous data, fabricated data. Those are concepts that didn't happen in their world. They had a job, and the job was to satisfy the person who was in charge. They wanted to please me. Eventually, I got them to the point where they could fill in the chart correctly, and we could then begin to talk about what the chart meant. But that he took half a day to do that was astonishing to me, but that was the truth. Now, at the end of that first trip to Africa, I'd found a guy with a university degree in nutritional science from, I think it was Kinshasa, Karume. And I'd been collecting data with my children, collecting the data so that I knew it was reliable from villages over the catchment area. And it was quite clear that although malnutrition was endemic to the whole area, some villages were much better than others. And I couldn't immediately see why. They may be very close in terms of position and apparent wealth. So I had no idea what was going on at that level. I was just thinking about it. And when we got to the end of that session, there was one corner of the catchment area where I had not been able to get to. And so I gave Karume some money and said, look, I want to complete the overall picture of the catchment area, But I haven't been to this village here where there is a clinic. You've been with me when I've done with the children. We've collected the data and looked at it and analysed it. I want you to go and collect the data from that village. So I came back the next year and I asked for the data, which he gave to me. I went, put it on my computer, and then I went back to him and said, Karume, you didn't collect this data. It's fabricated. I said, don't lie. I know it's fabricated. And he said, but it's about right. I said, yes, it is possible that this data could be true, but this data was not collected and measured by you. And he said, how do you know that? He didn't deny it. I said, well, I'll teach you at the end of the summer if I think it's safe to teach you. But I want to be certain that you've learnt this lesson, that the data is sacrosanct and you don't fabricate it as you did in this case. And at the end of the summer, I taught him how I did it. It was fairly simple. It was just digit preference in this case was all I needed, and it wasn't random. So that was interesting. He had a degree, and yet he had no love of data. Something was missing that I didn't understand at all. The other thing that had happened was that one of the nurses who I had trained had his own child die of malnutrition. That was unacceptable. And when I got Karume to press, because he wouldn't tell me why, his child had got sick and wasn't getting better. So he went to the witch doctor, who took all his money and made him poor for no benefit, and the child died. And I said, if I'd have been here, what would have happened? He said the child would have survived. And I said, what's going on here? And then slowly, over that next little while, it became apparent that they have a concept that we had in the past of fate, but their fate was evil spirits. So the reason my medicine worked from their perspective was not explained by scientific knowledge, but by my possession of the strongest spirit. Even a witch doctor said to me on one occasion, I cannot touch you. Your spirit is too strong. I don't know what he was talking about. I mean, yes, at one level I knew, but it's not a category that I would use. That's a resource that the Western world has had for a long while. I mean, it goes all the way back to Deuteronomy, doesn't it? If you will keep these laws, then you will flourish. And if you don't, you won't. Moral consequence is fundamental to understanding the world. There it was, Moses teaching the children of Israel the greatest commencement address of all time, and the bottom line, keep these laws, for then you will flourish. And when you fail, you will fail. And by the way, I've talked about this elsewhere, so most of you should know it, but it's most important that this begins early. Teach it to your children every day. Get them into the narrative history of the faith. You don't have to teach them theology. That's ridiculous. Don't even bother. What children love is stories. And they have one other great asset that no animal has. Written on their hearts is the knowledge of good and evil. Not fair, they say. Where did that come from? That's a moral statement of the highest order with tremendous implications. That's the Western world. Islam in particular is totally fatalistic. What Allah wills, Allah wills. That's all there is to it. You can't do anything about it. Allah doesn't love you. He doesn't relate to you. He doesn't care about you. A girl I was talking about, she'd never felt seen or related to Allah. But when in her dream, a man in white with a shining face, straight from Revelation, that she didn't know about, looked at her with love. She felt seen. The love was palpable. She risked her life. She said, I don't care if I die, but I don't want to lose Jesus. Now, people who say that, when saying it, put their life on the line, have something to teach us in a, what shall I say, mollycoddle word, but it's worse than that. Now we are addicted to our screens, and we are well on the way to losing the moral dimension. Wisdom has disappeared. Where's the wisdom we've lost in knowledge? Where's the knowledge we've lost in information? We're information rich, morally destitute. And you can see that left, right, and center. What's happening in Minnesota with its incredible corruption, but totally predictable by anybody who's understood what tribal culture is and how it works. And it's got nothing to do with anything other than loyalty to the group. Hershey Ali has done a YouTube discussion of what happens in Somalia. And she, of course, coming from there, not in the least bit surprised by what's happening in Minnesota. Totally and utterly predictable. The single question, is your life run by loyalty, or is it run by commitment to truth? Huge difference. Huge difference. Even in science now, you do best by making a minor addition to what the current ruling elite require, what narrative they wish to advance, which they had thought about. If you want to change something that has been in your particular area of expertise, get ready for what will come along. In the area of malnutrition, for instance, I was amazed at the sort of standard approach to the difference between kwashiorkor and marasmus, when it was blatantly obvious to me, with a primary interest in the pathophysiology of electrolyte control, that the story they were telling about protein was not an explanation. And their description of how the metabolism of water was going on could not be true. But all the famous names in the area had bought into that project. Well, I collected the data to show that was not true. It took me 3 or 4 years of arguing with the editor to get it published. But in the end, I did. But it doesn't advance your career. Fortunately, I wasn't going in that direction. It didn't really matter to me at one level. I wasn't primarily interested in a nutrition career. My interests were at a more basic level. But that was an example of loyalty over truth. There is a narrative that's being told. We had it again in COVID. The elite decided what narrative was going to explain COVID, and woe betide you if you didn't go along with it. And of course, ordinary people would look at you when you said, well, actually, there's no point in wearing a mask at this point. They would look upon you as though you were some kind of savage. Of course, it was perfectly true. The three people who really had the courage to go out and say so all had their careers put on hold. One of them is now head of NIH, but he lost, I think, 10 kilos in weight during the savage attacks on him that he endured, for which he was utterly unprepared, because the elite had an agenda. Nowadays, looking back on it, I mean, one of the questions I had never thought of, how could we miss this? You cannot think, at least I can't think, of a viral illness that doesn't wipe itself out within a few months, usually. Even plague goes away, we don't know where it goes to, and smallpox went away, we don't know where that went to. but it wasn't continuously active in any given area. So the story that we were being told, it had a clue immediately. This wasn't a normal virus. It was modified. And we now know, don't we, that it was modified in China, with the main aim being bacterial or biological warfare. They wanted to make a virus that couldn't be stopped quickly. I think China's population has fallen a lot, and one day we may find out how much of it was due to the escape from that lab in Wuhan. I mean, the guy who sounded the alarm himself died because they had made a super infective virus, whereas the viruses in the world at large are not like that. So now it's a very different matter because there's all sorts of immune things that have happened. But I had never stopped and thought, well, all viral illnesses come to an end. Of course they do. Otherwise we'd all be wiped out. So COVID was going to come to an end too, unless it was the end of the world. It didn't look like that. But of course, some clutch that I hadn't thought about that, but then neither did anybody else as far as I could see, not to make the point that is clearly at stake there. Yes, it's a fallen world from a Christian point of view, and that includes disease, and there are consequences. But the plan is all these things work together. They don't work together for good in individual instances. That would be nonsense to say. You just have to look. And Tom Wright points out a better translation of that is that God is at work in all things for good. In you. But the good is not defined by you. You're in a bigger story. We're all mortal. We all know that it is given unto man once to die, and after that, the judgment. That's the world we live in. Now, in South Africa, thoughtful black intellectuals are really hammering the ANC on their total mismanagement of the economy and the gross, unbelievable corruption that has gone on. And at least one of them is very seriously pointing out, look, the Western world has a different view of family, a different view of moral consequence. And the message is getting through. A lot of black people are saying we should let the Afrikaners run the economy, in effect. They can see that things have got worse, not better. When Mandela came out of prison, South Africa was selling electrical power to other countries in Africa. Now they have rotating brownouts. That's not progress. They had one of the best public health systems in the world. Very well run. Not anymore. It's not truly their fault. It's the recognition or the failure to recognize that there are moral and philosophical resources for running things that we're losing. What we're doing in the world now is proposing and using technological solutions to moral problems, and they don't work. And they won't work. Then I remembered, I'm going to read to you a paragraph, maybe a little bit more. A spectre is haunting the practice of medicine. Medicine as we have known it may become financially insupportable. In the developing world, the provision of even a modicum of medical care is beyond the resources of the poorest countries. The prospect of these developing world nightmares impinging on our Western lives is leading physicians to think in unphysicianly ways. They are beginning to accept the role of gatekeepers, and financial considerations are beginning to distort some areas of medical practice. The idea that cost-benefit, judged from a societal perspective, should legitimately influence what used to be primarily medical decisions is gaining ground. The ethical and philosophical implications of this change in practice are hardly mentioned, although history suggests they should be considered as moral threats to the body politic. This paper will attempt to provide a Christian perspective, juxtaposing and contrasting this to the secular faith which is dominant in the corridors of power. It will further propose the thesis that the problem is not primarily one either of economics or technology, but of culture, or more precisely, the lack of it. In neither the medical fraternity nor in society as a whole do we have the moral consensus necessary for what everyone would accept as a just and equitable solution. The basic limited resource is therefore cultural rather than material. As a society, we have agreement on neither the meaning of life nor the role of compassion, and cannot therefore expect to agree on what constitutes justice in the provision of medical services. That came to mind. I couldn't remember it exactly, but I wrote that, but I wrote it in 1993. I don't think I really understood what I was writing myself, or speaking, because that's from a talk given at a conference. It is astonishing that I didn't begin really to start thinking my way through this for a long, long while. And yet it should have hit us straight in the face. All people of my age who grew up in the Western world can immediately relate when I say, when you were growing up, no phones, did your mom worry about you going outside to play for half a day at a time? No. Did you lock your doors? No. How often did the police visit you in your area? Rarely, if ever. How much divorce was there? Oh, in 400 houses, I only knew of 2 divorces in 30 years. See what I'm talking about? This is a world that was economically much worse off. I mean, the time I'm describing, my dad came home with a pay packet of about $20 for a week. They immediately put 10% aside for the church, and then he gave it to my mother, except for a very small amount that he put aside, enough to accumulate by summertime so that we could have a holiday. When he got his holiday time, we could go somewhere. That was the world I lived in, utterly secure. I didn't know we were poor because we were morally and culturally rich. We didn't lock our doors. We had a lady with severe MS 2 or 3 doors from ours. Her husband was a bricklayer. He left in the morning when he'd got her up and got her to a seat in the kitchen. And there's a little background noise there. I hope it's not a noise that I object to. I love children's voices. So she wasn't alone. The door was open. The milkman came in. The baker came in. The rentman came in. They all knew where the money was in the teapot. Women in the area checked on her every now and again when they passed by. She was not lonely. That's a world that's gone.